I think I also want to briefly touch on. I think it's a little bit of a controversial topic, but it's not, super controversial. So Alzheimer's is I think is pretty bad, like everyone agrees. Schizophrenia, I think they're so-called like high functioning schizophrenia people, and there's the mental diversity movement type thing, where some people say they have schizophrenia, like they hear voices, but they know it's fake, quote unquote, and they can just live with it.
Right. So like everything that we call a disorder, we're probably calling multiple things that disorder, and schizophrenia is one of them. We're probably calling several different things schizophrenia. But even in our current, with our current system, what we know is that roughly somewhere between a quarter and a third of people have one psychotic episode and then go on and kind of function pretty well. They may not be functioning at exactly the same level as peers with similar amounts of education and all whatever advantages they may have had in their life, but they're functioning pretty well. And then there's a group of about a third to a quarter who have some impairment but are not what you might necessarily think of as schizophrenic. When you picture someone with schizophrenia. And then there's about a third to a quarter, and that middle group might be a third to a half, to make my numbers add up. And then there's about a third to a quarter who have the really severe, really progressive disease that you would just obviously know is schizophrenia. And then there are people like the ones that you're mentioning, Neb, who have psychotic features. They're aware that they are experiencing something that everyone else would say is not there, like a voice or something like that. But they don't have schizophrenia in the sense that they don't have the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. They don't have the cognitive impairment and the lack of ability to follow instructions and to reach goals and things like that. So they don't have some of those other symptoms or the disorganized behavior, but they do have something psychotic that's happening. And some people in that position have called themselves as having high functioning schizophrenia, or have called it a sort of neurodiversity, something like that. There's it's called the hearing voices movement in the UK, where they say I hear voices and it's fine. I like them. I'm happy with them. I recognize that they're not real, and it's just part of my different way of being. It's tricky because lots of people actually hear voices, but don't think of it as psychotic. They're just sort of aware that your brain plays tricks on you sometimes. And we don't really know if the people in the hearing voices movement are just kind of exaggerating normal phenomenon that all the rest of us would endorse, or if they really do have something psychotic happening that is the only thing happening and they just kind of learn to live with it. That's a little up in the air right now.
Yeah, so two things I want to address in that one. So the first is it sounds like there's an analogy with the self-diagnosing autism thing, right? That we see. Yep. where a lot of, maybe it's become fashionable to be autistic in a sense. Mm-hmm. And so lots of people on Reddit or various social media will say, oh yeah, I have autism, because I guess the implication is, so you're probably smart, right? You're one of those tech people if you have autism. And so it's flattering in that sense to say that you have autism.
Right. Or if you haven't achieved everything that you want in your life, it's not your fault.
You're smart, but also you have autism, and that's why.
Yeah. Isn't that terrible? Yeah. Yep. And so we don't know if the hearing voices movement is suffering from some of those same paradigm changes or whatever it is that's happening in that process, or if there really are people, because it's a small movement and it seems to be people who, I would never diagnose someone with a disorder if they weren't experiencing functional impairment. So I'm just yeah, that's normal. But they have said, no, I'm not normal. Other people would say I'm not normal, and yet I don't have a disorder, and you should just respect. Yeah, so I don't. Well, I don't it's know. Hard to. We haven't really decided what to do with it.
Yeah, I don't know that in their mental framework they wouldn't phrase it as I don't have a disorder, right? They want to say I do have the disorder, right? I am schizophrenic.
They actually say this is part of the problem, is that part of what they're saying, like this is true in the self-diagnosis of autism movement as well. They've stopped calling it a people who've self-diagnosed now say it's a neurodiversity and that it isn't a disorder, it's just a different neurotype, it's just a different way of being. So they're saying they have the disorder of autism that I would not agree that they have, and
it's not a disorder.
That it's not a disorder. So
Yeah.
it doesn't always necessarily, it's not always coherent. It's a social movement, and it hasn't coalesced in a way that necessarily makes sense yet.
Well, I guess it doesn't make sense. Like from their perspective, it's because there's a different categorization schema among professional psychologists versus a layperson, right?
Right.
Like, I guess
In
within professional psychology, autism is a disorder, but
it is. But again, there's lots of people who have what's called the broad autism phenotype, where they basically have some symptoms of autism, but they're not causing them functional impairment. So we don't call that a disorder. So when people say like, I have autism, but it doesn't cause functional impairment, so you shouldn't call autism a disorder, I'm like, well, if you don't have functional impairment, I would never call it a disorder. So you've created a straw man. So it's complicated, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, so the other thing I wanted to bring up is you said like it's normal to hear voices, and that surprises me. I don't think I hear voices. Right. So what's the prevalence of that? Like,
the prevalence is hard to estimate because it depends on how you ask, and it depends on if you kind of prime people to say like, "Oh, that happens to you sometimes, right?" Versus,
only weird people do this. Are you?
Only weird people have this. Are you? Sometimes people have. You're right. So most, the majority of people report at least one what's called psychotic-like experience that occurs in their life. Seeing something that isn't there, hearing something that isn't there, feeling something that isn't there, something like that. Something like in kids, the prevalence rates go up to what do they go up to in kids? 84%, depending on how you ask, and in adults it's like 67%. So a lot of people, even under the most generous way of asking, say like, no, that never happens to me. Under the most generous way of asking, 2/3 of people say like, oh yeah, that's happened to me once in a while. About 8 or 9% of people say that happens to them fairly often. And about 3% of people say it happens and it's like impairing me in some way.
Yeah, I mean,
those are the prevalences.
When you talk about like different ways of phrasing it, like that's definitely the case, because one of the ways you phrase it is like, oh yeah, that does happen to me, which is specifically like, do you sometimes see something that's not there?
Right.
I was like, sure, everybody has, right? Like, you say, oh,
that's normal.
Yeah, it's my friend, and then you look and say, oh no, it's not my friend. It's some.
Oh, that's not my friend. Yeah.
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 So surely that's happened to everybody at some point. So then, like, fine.
Right, and that kind of confusion happens in people all the time. So when they say they're hearing voices, it's also not clear what they mean. When we ask them about the phenomenology, the texture of what they say they're hearing, they don't describe it in the same way that schizophrenic people describe their voices. But that doesn't mean they're not. Like this is all pretty subjective, right?
Yeah. So I mean, so I'm bringing in another topic, which is aphantasia, the idea that when you imagine something, some people like have a visual experience when they're imagining something. Like if you say like imagine Pinocchio, right? Some people like will see an image of Pinocchio in their mind's eye, and some people won't. They have like I guess mainly an intellectual or semantic experience rather than a visual one.
Yep.
I'm struggling because I do have the visual experience, so I don't know what it's like to not have the visual experience. People who don't
and
have
I think I don't have the
experience.
visual experience, and the way you described it sounds fine to me.
Okay. So the people who don't have the visual experience is what they have something called aphantasia, which is supposed to mean like no, does not imagine, I guess, if you look at the Greek roots.
Aphantasia.
Yeah.
A meaning the skill is lost or doesn't exist. Yeah.
And fantasia like
meaning fantasize. Yeah.
Yeah. So the reason I'm quote unquote confident that I don't hear voices is because I think I have aphantasia for sound, You know, like when I imagine something that would have a sound, I don't hear
Oh, interesting.
sound in my mind's ear in a sense, you know?
Right. Okay.
And I don't know if that's normal. Do people usually are they able to perceive sound in their imagination?
Wow. I have no idea. And what's hard about this is often our experience is so normal that we don't know. And even when we do try and guess, we're often wrong. Like when you then look at like I don't feel like I visualize things, but I also wouldn't say I don't visualize things because something visual is happening. Like when you say Pinocchio, I can like I don't think of anything, but when I'm left with an impression of a certain color of his skin, of his white cap, right? Like I'm black shoes, like I'm left with clear visual
Right.
information. And then like if you ask me to visualize, and I try and do it, I can like I can. So and I don't know what I typically do. And when you ask like, do I hear sounds? Do they play in my head when I'm picturing them?
Like, you know, imagine a steel ball falling onto a metal sheet, right? And then so like logically we should make this clanging sound, right? And I can
Right.
from a semantic wise, like yeah, but I don't like hear it, you know?
Right. I think I don't hear it unless you ask me to,
Even
and
like
then I
when
can.
I try to
Similar,
hear it, I don't like.
you don't.
Yeah, like I understand that it does, but like of the sensations I'm having, I'm like, yeah, that's definitely not sound that I'm having. You know, that makes sense.
Oh, that's fascinating. Can you hear a song in your head?
Hang on, I have music playing right now, so let me pause the music. Yeah, I think I can. Like like I'm visualizing a song, and I think like I think it is like I am perceiving. It's like the thing is
Right.
you can tell like even when you met like for people without aphantasia. I don't know if how relatable this is to you, Steph, but you, like let's say I imagine Pinocchio. Like I have my actual field of vision, right, where I see my computer, my screen, and all that, and I have a separate field of vision where I see Pinocchio, and I can distinguish between the two. I'm not like confused. I was like, oh, Pinocchio's actually in front of me, right? So in that same way, like I hear the song that I'm thinking of, but I can tell that I'm not really hearing it, right? So,
Right. I think that's
but
what
that's
happens.
sufficient enough for me to say yes, I am hearing it in my mind's ear. But for sound
Yeah. See,
effects,
this
I
is
don't
why this
think.
stuff is so hard to figure out. I think I'm hearing the sound effect, or at least can, but do less of that with visualizing.
Okay.
So I think we have the opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating.